All right, welcome back. This is our second video on the classification of economic activities. And again, now we're into the secondary sector activities. And so what this is the sector of the economy that takes those materials produced in the primary sector, raw materials, and adds value to them through transformation. So any form of manufacturing. Now we can think about this in terms of what many of us think about in terms of industrial production. And in this case, heavy industry, for example, the making of a bulldozer, or in fact, of an airplane. But there's also light industrial production, those things that are small. In fact, right now I'm speaking into a video conferencing device. That's light industrial manufacturing. We also have food production. That is, if you today eat a frozen pizza, well, that's in fact manufacturing. That pizza is manufactured. But we also have in the secondary sector the infrastructural components of this. All of those activities, for example, those people that put in cable. We're all using the internet now, and our cable television and Netflix. Well, those people that put the cable in, the people that lay roads, the people that build bridges or buildings or houses, that's all part of the secondary sector activity. And again, the important idea in this is that this is a value added. By adding skill, labor, and transforming raw materials, we add value in the economy. Okay, so when we look at this, one of the most important ideas when we talk about, though, secondary activities is this idea of the industrial belt or the industrial core. And what you can see here, and it's kind of an interesting idea, is that people have often talked about this north hemisphere industrial belt that extends from the center of North America and very southern Canada, north, the very northern edge of Mexico, all the way through Europe, and then across eastern Russia, and then down into China. And this has been traditionally considered this industrial belt. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other industrial core areas. You'll notice, of course, that we have, for example, the area in northern India along the Ganges plain that is in fact India's industrial core. We can also see very clearly that in Australia we have industrial cores in Perth, or you might say that we can also see some of these in terms of areas of South America and southern Brazil, for example. All of these are industrial regions for those countries, but within the industrial belt is kind of the global production center. Now, the question is, why? And it's an important idea to understand industrialization and industry in terms of several factors. First of all, that we talk about location of manufacturing in terms of this kind of interaction between two things. One is that the idea that we do things, we manufacture things, and there's idea of what we call spatially fixed costs. So again, for your notes, spatially fixed costs are those aspects of making something, the cost of making something, that really doesn't change across space. So for example, if a state has a minimum wage, fixed minimum wage, well, that means that the cost, the minimum cost of labor, is going to be uniform across that space. Doesn't matter where in that state you are. That doesn't mean, however, that skilled labor doesn't vary across space. But again, the minimum wage. Or in the United States, the cost of unemployment insurance, it doesn't matter where you are, that cost is the same. So that's a spatially fixed cost, kind of a uniform playing field. But most of the time, location of manufacturing are influenced by what we call spatially variable costs. So, for example, the movement of goods. It is significantly less expensive to move goods via rail, especially big things, as opposed to by truck. And so you might put a factory, if you need a raw material, such as iron ore, if you're making steel, well, you need to be where you can move iron ore, very big, very heavy, very kind of, you have to have a lot of it. You want to have that near low cost transportation, rail or water. Okay, so we see transportation and its infrastructure significantly influencing where things are, the cost of movement. You might also look, though, at the cost of rent. So in other words, if you're going to build a factory or a processing plant, what is the cost of land? That is what we would call rent. And so rent is very variable across space. But sometimes these spatially variable costs are counterbalancing. That is, that transportation means that you want to locate your steel mill around water or rail. But the problem with that is that on the East Coast, the rent is really, really high. And so you might want to be a little farther away. But labor costs or the availability of labor may be harder in those areas. So all these things pull at different aspects of where, and that's kind of, if you put them all together, that's why we get manufacturing in given locations. Okay, so when we talk about this, then what we kind of think about is distance and cost or price kind of come together, and we call this the spatial margin of profitability. So again, if we are in this area, our profit, in other words, our cost of production is lowest, and in a sense, our profit is highest. And anytime we get beyond that, we begin to lose money. And so we talk about this thing they call the spatial margin of profitability. That is, where can I locate and still be profitable? Now, for some manufacturing, this area of profitable production is really, really broad. In other words, in many respects, if you think about manufacturing of heavy industry, anywhere that you have extensive rail systems, water systems, you might be able to do that. Or if you're thinking about an area, for example, of something like chip manufacturing, well, you can do that pretty much anywhere because there's very low cost to the material movement. You don't need a lot of space to do it. And so really the only factor there is skilled labor. And so we can say that the spatial margin of profitability depends on the factors of manufacturing. Now, manufacturing has changed dramatically. And one factor that affects that probably more than anything else is the cost of labor. And so if we look at the United States, in 1990, we go back 30 years, a significant portion of our manufacturing remained in the East Coast of the United States and kind of in the Midwest. Over time, however, if we kind of go forward to now, those areas have changed a little bit. Manufacturing stays, it has a certain inertia to it, but if you'll notice, and I'm going to go back in this one, if we look at 1990, and I want to focus right here, you'll see that there's manufacturing here, but these numbers are moderate here, and they're heavier here and here, kind of in our industrial belt. You see kind of here. And what happens over time in terms of manufacturing is that, and I'm going to focus on the Pittsburgh area here in Cleveland, it's not that manufacturing isn't there, but the number of jobs have decreased. Manufacturing as a component of the U.S. economy has contracted. Now, if we look at it in terms of changes, what we can see is that in most of the eastern part, what we would have called the industrial belt, has really declined in manufacturing jobs significantly. Whereas what we can see is that in some areas, especially in Minnesota, we begin to pick up. Also, we see a real increase in southeastern Texas and in Southern California. The other place we'll see is along the US-Mexican border. And so manufacturing does move, but it moves on certain factors that are less consistent with where those raw materials are, and now are beginning to be much more consistent with where labor is. All right, now, the other part of this that I want you to look at, remember we talked about agriculture and the primary sector in terms of economies. And one of the things that we're beginning to see is that now we move into the secondary component of the economy. And for much of the world, manufacturing is a significant part of their economy. If you look at China, for example, China, this represents almost half of their economy. When you look at West Africa, significant parts of their economies. Mexico, of course, significant part. In the United States, significantly less, but still important. So as we move up through these, you're going to see that they become more important to the world's economies. And these vary slightly across space. Now, what has happened, I do want to focus, and this is in the United States, is that the importance, and this is in terms of shares, in terms of the total GDP of the US economy, over time, both the manufacturing sector, although it still is significant, and the agriculture and mining, so primary and secondary sectors of the economy, have shrunk in their importance. And again, that means that other aspects of the economy have had to take their place. And so that's where we get to tertiary activities in the next video.